It was a warm evening in early spring, the kind of night when most people in the apartment complex kept their windows cracked open to let in the last traces of cool air before summer set in. Families moved about their routines, televisions buzzed faintly through walls, children played in courtyards below, and somewhere in the building, a mother prepared to step out for just a moment. She lived on the third floor, raising two children largely on her own. By all accounts, she was attentive, reliable, and cautious. She had no history of running away, no reason to disappear. And yet, within the span of just a few minutes, she would step out her door, walk into the stairwell, and never be seen alive again. The timeline was painfully simple. Around 8:30 p.m., her children were already settled for the night. She slipped on a light jacket, leaving her shoes by the door, as she often did, and carried only her keys. Her purse, her wallet, even her phone remained inside the apartment. She told no one where she was going. What happened after that moment exists only in fragments of memory and the haunting silence of a stairwell. Neighbors on the second floor reported hearing footsteps descending. Another remembered the sound of a door closing, though they couldn't say which one. No one heard a scream, no argument, no panicked shuffle that might suggest a struggle. Within minutes, the hallway returned to silence. When her children later noticed she hadn't returned, they assumed she was visiting a neighbor or stepping outside for fresh air. But as the night stretched into early morning and she did not come back, worry turned to fear. By dawn, the police were called. Officers entered her apartment and found no signs of forced entry. The living room was tidy, dinner dishes still in the sink. On the counter lay her purse and wallet. Her car keys and vehicle were untouched in the parking lot. The absence of shoes by the entryway told investigators she had stepped out quickly, perhaps intending only to circle the courtyard or meet someone briefly. But the absence of everything else raised far darker questions. Detectives moved quickly, canvassing the immediate area. They combed through the stairwell, the hallways, and the parking lot for any trace of her. A K-9 unit was brought in, and the dog picked up her scent in the stairwell. But by the time it reached the landing between the second and first floor, the trail abruptly stopped. No scent carried out into the parking lot, none into the adjacent woods. It was as if she had vanished into the walls themselves. Residents described an unsettling realization in the hours that followed. This was not a sprawling city block where someone could slip away unseen. This was a compact three-story building with only a few entry and exit points. Every pathway was visible to dozens of tenants, yet no one saw her leave, no one saw anyone carry her out. The stairwell, plain concrete steps, fluorescent lights buzzing. Overhead, chipped paint along the walls, was the last place she was known to have been. The first 24 hours of a disappearance are critical, and police treated it as such. They questioned neighbors one by one. Some insisted they hadn't seen or heard a thing. Others recalled odd details that, when stitched together, painted more confusion than clarity. One woman thought she heard a heavy door slam harder than usual around the time of her disappearance, but she couldn't place which door. Another man swore he saw her leaning over the railing on the third floor earlier that evening, though his account conflicted with the timeline her children gave. Every detail seemed to fall apart under scrutiny, leaving detectives frustrated and the family desperate. Her mother was one of the first to arrive on scene. Standing in the small apartment, she recognized instantly how wrong it all felt. Her daughter never left without her purse. She never abandoned her children. She would not simply step outside and vanish. That absence, the missing shoes, the untouched wallet, the waiting children, did not speak of choice. It spoke of interruption. As night fell on the second day, fear spread through the complex. Tenants began double-locking their doors, glancing over shoulders when walking the halls. Parents pulled their children in early. The stairwell, once just a mundane feature of the building, began to feel like a place where something deeply wrong had happened. People avoided using it at night, preferring the longer route of the elevator. Rumors churned in whispers, an abduction, a stalker, someone hiding in plain sight. For investigators, the absence of physical evidence was alarming. No fingerprints out of the ordinary, no signs of forced entry or a struggle, no foreign DNA on the stair rails. It was as if the stairwell had swallowed her whole. Detectives worked late into the night, revisiting the simple fact that she had never made it to the parking lot. Her car remained where she had left it, and surveillance from nearby businesses captured nothing of value. The case began with urgency, but it was urgency without direction. Police reassured the family they were doing everything possible. They checked nearby highways, issued alerts, and questioned anyone with even a passing connection to her. But each step only seemed to deepen the void. The mystery of how a young mother could step into a stairwell and not emerge weighed heavily on everyone who knew her. By the third night, the apartment complex was wrapped in a kind of eerie silence. Neighbors moved cautiously, speaking in hushed tones as if afraid the walls themselves might be listening. The stairwell, its chipped paint, its cold echo, its fluorescent hum, was no longer just a passage between floors. It had become the last known witness to a disappearance that made no sense. And yet, even in those earliest days, there was a chilling thought that lingered unspoken. If she never made it out of the building, then perhaps she never left it at all. The first hours after she was reported missing were frantic and disorganized, but also critical. Detectives knew that every minute mattered, that if she had been taken, there might still be a chance to find her alive. Officers moved through the apartment complex, knocking on doors, waking residents, asking the same urgent questions. Did anyone see her step outside? Did anyone hear anything unusual? Did anyone notice a stranger lingering near the parking lot? The answers varied, but none gave clarity. People remembered noises, shadows, glimpses that didn't add up. One tenant claimed she heard footsteps echoing in the stairwell around the time of the disappearance, but couldn't say whether they belonged to the missing mother or someone else. Another insisted they saw a figure leave the building carrying something bulky, though they admitted it was dark and distant. Every detail seemed to splinter the timeline further apart. Outside, uniformed officers expanded the search radius. They moved into the wooded patches behind the complex, sweeping flashlights across thick undergrowth. They checked drainage ditches, retention ponds, and narrow service roads where someone might abandon evidence or a body. It was exhausting work, carried out under the pressing weight of knowing how little time had passed since she was last seen. If she had walked away voluntarily, she could not have gone far. If she had been forced, the trail was still fresh. Yet despite the urgency, the search revealed nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no signs of disturbance. It was as though she had stepped into thin air. Canine units were brought in, adding another layer of effort. The dogs picked up her scent in the stairwell, the same place detectives had already identified as the last confirmed location. The animals followed the trail down to the first landing, noses working the corners, paws scuffing against the concrete. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the scent stopped. No continuation through the exit door, no drift into the parking lot, nothing leading outside. The dogs circled back, confused, picking up the scent again only on the stairs themselves, then losing it once more. Handlers tried several times, but the result was always the same. Her trail ended halfway down the stairwell, as if the rest of her journey had been erased. By dawn, detectives knew they were facing something deeply troubling. A disappearance without physical evidence is difficult enough, but when the trail stops inside the building itself, it suggests a far narrower possibility. Someone within those walls might know more than they were saying. Suspicion began to quietly turn inward. Officers looked harder at the tenants they interviewed, watching for nervous shifts in body language, inconsistencies in stories. They paid close attention to men living alone, to neighbors who seemed overly curious about the case, to anyone with access to maintenance or storage areas. Nothing stood out yet, but the questions had begun. Meanwhile, the family was reeling. Her mother, exhausted and shaking, stood before television cameras that afternoon, pleading for her daughter's safe return. She would never leave her children, she said firmly, her voice breaking. Someone has her. Please, if you know anything, please bring her back. Her words echoed across local news stations, her face appearing on screens in homes throughout the city. Flyers were printed by the hundreds, carrying her smiling photograph and the words "missing" in bold type across the top. Volunteers taped them to telephone poles, slipped them under car windshield wipers, posted them in grocery stores and gas stations. Within hours, her image was everywhere, a constant reminder of the mystery that had just unfolded. Detectives pursued every angle they could. They checked local hospitals, shelters, bus stations. They contacted nearby towns to be on the lookout. They searched wooded trails with ATVs and retraced every possible path she might have taken on foot. Nothing surfaced. The absence of evidence began to feel heavier with each hour that passed. Investigators returned again and again to the stairwell, trying to make sense of what the dogs had indicated. How could a person's scent simply stop in the middle of a concrete landing? Unless she had been carried, or unless something had happened right there that left no visible sign. By the end of that first night, the energy around the case shifted from hopeful urgency to quiet dread. Officers continued knocking on doors, expanding outward, but the leads were already thinning. The search of nearby ditches and wooded lots yielded no sign of her. No suspicious vehicles had been reported in the area. Neighbors gave conflicting stories, none strong enough to move the case forward. The puzzle was forming, but every piece seemed to be missing. It was in those moments, when exhaustion set in and answers refused to come, that darker questions started to creep into the minds of investigators. Could this have been an abduction? If so, how did someone pull it off inside a crowded apartment building without being seen or heard? Or was this something more personal, something involving someone she knew, someone who had reason and opportunity in the narrow window between her last footsteps and the silence that followed? The children slept restlessly in their grandmother's care that night, unaware of the growing storm of suspicion, grief, and fear that surrounded them. Neighbors locked their doors, whispering to each other in uneasy tones. Detectives filed their reports, none of which brought them closer to an answer. And yet, beneath all of the confusion, there remained a single, chilling certainty. A mother had walked into the stairwell of her apartment building and never come back out. The next step would not only test the limits of the investigation, but also the patience of a family desperate for answers as suspicion began to fall closer to home. The investigation quickly shifted toward the people who had been closest to her. Detectives knew that in cases of sudden disappearance, it was often someone familiar who carried motive or opportunity. The estranged husband was the first to be questioned. Their relationship had been fractured for years, marked by arguments over custody and finances. Neighbors recalled shouting matches that sometimes spilled into the hallway, moments that made people uneasy. When officers pressed him, he denied knowing anything about her vanishing. He provided an alibi, insisting he had been with family at the time, though the details blurred under closer inspection. Detectives could not dismiss him, but without evidence, there was no way to move beyond suspicion. An ex-boyfriend followed on the list of interviews. Their relationship had ended months before, and by most accounts, it had ended badly. Friends described him as controlling, someone who resented her independence and the fact that she was moving on. He admitted to police that he had been upset over the breakup, but claimed he hadn't spoken to her in weeks. His story checked out on paper, but detectives couldn't shake the possibility that anger and rejection might have lingered. He became a person of interest, though nothing concrete tied him to that stairwell on the night she disappeared. Attention then turned to the building itself. With more than a dozen tenants living within earshot of the stairwell, detectives believed someone had seen or heard something. One neighbor reported hearing a heavy thud at roughly the same time she went missing, though they couldn't say whether it was a door slamming or something falling. Another tenant insisted they saw a woman resembling her walking toward a bus stop later that night. That account, however, conflicted directly with the timeline her children and family had provided. Police were forced to weigh which details carried truth and which were products of faulty memory or rumor. The more they interviewed, the more the stories clashed, creating a fractured picture with no solid center. Forensic teams searched the stairwell with painstaking care. Every railing was dusted, every surface checked for fingerprints. The results were overwhelming in quantity, but empty in meaning. Dozens of prints covered the area. Residents, visitors, delivery workers, maintenance staff. None stood out as unusual. None linked directly to her disappearance. DNA swabs were collected, but without a body or a crime scene, there was little context for comparison. The stairwell, once thought to hold the answer, offered only noise. Detectives worked to establish a clear timeline of her last movements. That effort proved maddening. Her children's testimony gave a firm starting point, but beyond the moment she stepped into the stairwell, certainty ended. Accounts from neighbors shifted with each retelling. Some thought they saw her earlier in the evening. Others insisted they noticed her later, but few could place exact times. Even small details, what she was wearing, whether she carried anything, varied so widely that investigators struggled to determine fact from assumption. The case became trapped in a fog of conflicting recollections. As days turned into weeks, the investigation lost its sharp edge. Officers continued to question tenants, including maintenance workers who had access to locked areas of the building. Some were cooperative, others defensive. Nothing definitive emerged. Surveillance from nearby businesses was reviewed again and again, but no footage captured her leaving the complex. No bus drivers remembered seeing her. No cab companies reported a fare under her name. The trail remained fixed inside that stairwell, and beyond it stretched only emptiness. For the family, frustration grew unbearable. They knew her habits, knew her devotion to her children. To them, the idea that she had chosen to leave made no sense. They watched as detectives circled the same suspects, asked the same questions, and came back with nothing. Each passing day felt like evidence slipping away, like answers rotting into silence. The weight of not knowing pressed heavier than grief itself. Behind closed doors, investigators admitted the case was stalling. They had suspects, but no crime scene. They had leads, but no consistency. They had suspicions, but no proof. The stairwell had become a symbol of paralysis, a place where time stopped, where answers ended before they began. Detectives filed their reports, logged their interviews, and quietly acknowledged that without new information, the trail would run cold. And as the investigation slowed, the focus began to shift in unsettling ways. If she had not been taken by a stranger, and if neighbors' accounts could not be trusted, then who within her circle had the motive and access to make her vanish so completely? The suspicion that had once spread broadly across the community began tightening again, narrowing back to the people she had trusted most. Weeks became months, and the search for her turned into a painful cycle of hope, followed by silence. In those early weeks, the family refused to believe she was gone without a trace. Her mother walked the apartment complex repeatedly, knocking on doors that had already been questioned, asking neighbors to remember anything they might have overlooked. She visited shelters, bus stations, and hospitals, handing out flyers with her daughter's face, her voice trembling but steady with determination. She called detectives every week, sometimes every day, pressing for updates even when there was nothing new to share. Vigils were held outside the apartment building, candles glowing faintly against the concrete walls where her trail had ended. Neighbors gathered, some praying, others standing quietly, the stairwell looming in the background like a monument to unanswered questions. As time passed, the family's daily life was redefined by absence. Her children grew up with the silence of not knowing. They learned to navigate birthdays without her, school milestones without her presence in the crowd, holidays marked by an empty chair. Each year they watched as their grandmother fought to keep the search alive, her determination serving as both a comfort and a reminder of how far away the truth remained. They carried the weight of whispered rumors at school, where other children repeated what their parents speculated, that she had run away, that she had been taken, that maybe she hadn't wanted to stay. The uncertainty became part of their identity, shaping how they saw themselves and the world around them. In the community, theories multiplied. Some whispered about human trafficking, pointing to other cases where women had vanished without warning. Others believed she had left on her own, overwhelmed by the pressures of single parenthood. Still others suspected foul play closer to home, revisiting suspicions of her estranged husband, the ex-boyfriend, or even someone living in the very building where she disappeared. These conflicting ideas divided people. For some, it was easier to believe she had left voluntarily. It made the mystery less frightening. For others, The notion of abduction explained the suddenness of her vanishing, but carried its own horrors. The debates didn't bring answers, only more tension and speculation. For law enforcement, the case quietly shifted from urgent investigation to a file among dozens of cold cases. Detectives who had once been a constant presence at the apartment complex began moving on to newer investigations. Officially, the case was still open. Unofficially, most admitted that the trail had gone completely cold. Privately, some detectives acknowledged that unless new evidence surfaced or a body was found, there would be little they could do. They had combed the stairwell, the woods, the ditches, the surrounding streets, and still had nothing. The case had no leads, no clear suspect, no tangible proof of what had happened after she stepped out of her apartment that night. Her mother refused to let the silence become permanent. Each year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, she organized a gathering. Family and supporters stood outside with candles, holding posters that bore her daughter's photograph, refusing to let the community forget. Reporters came and went, capturing sound bites, asking the same questions they had asked in the beginning. The answers never changed. She would remind the cameras that her daughter would never abandon her children, that someone somewhere knew the truth, that she would not stop fighting until answers were found. Over time, her voice grew more tired, but the fire behind it never faded. The anniversaries became markers of grief, reminders of how much time had passed without resolution. For the children, each passing year widened the gap between memory and reality. They struggled to recall the sound of her voice, the small routines of daily life that had once felt ordinary. What remained were fragments, stories told by their grandmother, photographs tucked into frames, and the ever-present reminder that their mother's fate was unknown. The silence that hung over them was not just about loss, it was about being forced to grow up in the shadow of a question no one could answer. Detectives occasionally revisited the case, often when a new officer joined the department or when pressure from the family resurfaced in the media. Each time, they sifted through the old files, the conflicting statements, the fingerprint reports that led nowhere. Each time, they came to the same conclusion. Without new evidence, their hands were tied. Behind closed doors, some admitted their belief that she had likely been killed and hidden somewhere nearby, though they never had enough to prove it. Others leaned toward the possibility that she had left voluntarily, though that theory was rejected outright by the family. The truth remained elusive, locked away in silence. As the years stretched into nearly 2 decades, the case became a haunting presence in the community. The stairwell was still there, its chipped paint and concrete steps carrying the weight of what had been lost. New families moved into the building, unaware of the history until neighbors told them. Some avoided talking about it, uncomfortable with the idea that such a mystery could have unfolded within walls so familiar. But for those who had lived through it, the memory never faded. The building itself seemed to hold a permanent scar, a reminder of the night when a mother walked out her door and never returned. And through all of it, her family continued their vigil. They fought against fading attention, against the temptation to accept silence as an answer. They believed, deep down, that the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered, hidden somewhere close, just beyond reach. What they could not know, what no one could have imagined, was that the answers they had spent 18 years begging for were not in some faraway place. They had been hidden all along, buried within the very building where she was last seen. 5 years after the night she vanished, her name was no longer spoken daily in newsrooms or whispered in grocery store aisles. The case had slipped into the quiet place where unsolved disappearances often end up, a box in a police archive stacked among dozens of others marked with the word open, but rarely touched. For her family, time did not erase the wound. But for investigators juggling new crimes, her case became another cold file gathering dust on a shelf. The box contained the standard remnants of an investigation, statements from neighbors, transcripts of interviews with the estranged husband and ex-boyfriend, fingerprint cards from the stairwell, and flyers that once papered the city. On the cover was her photo, the same smiling face her mother still kept in frames at home. Inside, it told a story with no ending, a puzzle frozen in its incomplete state. Detectives had scrawled notes in the margins. Timeline unclear, inconsistent witness accounts, no physical evidence. Pages documented searches of wooded areas, canvassing of bus stations, and dozens of interviews. Yet, none of it brought clarity. A new detective, assigned to the cold case unit years later, pulled the file one afternoon. He scanned the contents, looking with fresh eyes. What struck him wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. Despite repeated searches of the grounds outside, no report detailed a thorough inspection of the building's hidden spaces. Crawl areas, maintenance shafts, sealed-off utility rooms, those places had been noted but never documented as fully cleared. At the time, resources were stretched thin, and searches focused outward into the woods and the city beyond. The building itself had been treated as a backdrop, not as a possible container of the secret. The detective noted these gaps and considered the implications. If her scent had disappeared inside the stairwell, wasn't it possible she had never left the building at all? But with no active leads, no warrant for new searches, and limited manpower, his review stopped short of action. Other cases demanded priority, cases with fresh evidence and living victims. His observations were recorded in a brief summary and then filed away. The file returned to the shelf, the questions unresolved. Meanwhile, the apartment complex itself began to change. Ownership transferred hands, renovations were made, tenants moved in and out, fresh paint covered some of the aging walls, new carpet was laid in hallways, and unfamiliar families settled into units where the story of her disappearance was nothing more than a vague warning told by longtime residents. For many who lived there later, the building was just another affordable option in a busy city. But for those who remembered, every stairwell step still carried unease. Her mother never stopped reminding authorities about the gaps. She pressed them with letters, calls, and meetings, asking if new technology might help, if fresh searches might be considered. She asked whether they had checked every wall, every basement, every hidden crawl space. Each time she was met with sympathy, sometimes with genuine concern, but always with the same answer. There was no new evidence, no justification to reopen the physical search. The case was not closed, but without movement, it felt indistinguishable from one that was. For her children, now teenagers, the absence grew heavier. They had spent their formative years under the weight of speculation, hearing classmates whisper about their mother, watching neighbors avoid their eyes, and enduring anniversaries that brought cameras but no answers. They carried the knowledge that the investigation had stalled, that their mother's name sat inside a cardboard box in a storage room, gathering dust. Hope was something they wanted to cling to, but it often felt cruel, an echo of what should have been but wasn't. In private, detectives admitted their frustration. Some believed she had been killed and her body hidden nearby, maybe in a place overlooked during the initial chaos. Others leaned toward the theory she had left voluntarily, though the evidence for that was non-existent. The truth was they had nothing concrete, and with each passing year, the silence surrounding the case deepened. The apartment building continued on with new paint, new tenants, and new routines, but beneath the renovations, the structure was unchanged. The stairwell where her scent had ended was still there. The crawl spaces and shafts the new detective had noted were still there too, unsearched, silent, part of the bones of the building. And somewhere in that silence, the truth remained, waiting for the day it would no longer be ignored. 18 years had passed since she vanished in the stairwell, and in that time, the apartment building had changed in countless ways. Families moved in, others moved out. Paint was refreshed, locks were replaced, hallways echoed with new voices who knew nothing of the mystery that had once defined the place. For most, the disappearance had become little more than a local legend, a cautionary story whispered in passing. But for the handful of tenants who had lived there long enough to remember, the building had never shaken the shadow of that night. The return of those memories came not through a police investigation, but through something far more ordinary. A plumbing problem developed deep within the structure, forcing maintenance crews to access sealed areas of the building that had been untouched for years. These were crawl spaces and utility passages hidden behind heavy panels and rusted locks, places most tenants never thought about. As workers pried open doors and cut into walls, the sound of drilling and hammering stirred something in the minds of those who had lived there during the first years after she disappeared. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, whispers about her return began to resurface. One longtime tenant recalled how, in the weeks following her disappearance, a foul odor had filled the basement hallway. It had been strong enough that people complained to management, though nothing came of it. The explanation given at the time was that sewage pipes had backed up, or perhaps a dead animal had gotten caught in the walls. But the memory lingered. Another neighbor admitted that she had avoided the basement laundry room for months, not because of the smell, but because of something she couldn't explain. A heaviness, a sense of unease every time she descended the stairs. She told herself it was imagination, nerves rattled by the fear of what had happened upstairs. Yet, when the workers began opening those sealed-off areas years later, that unease returned in full. As rumors spread through the complex, people began to talk more openly about what they remembered. Some admitted they had heard strange noises in the nights after she vanished, like muffled thumps or scraping sounds behind walls. Others recalled how quickly the management at the time had dismissed tenants' concerns, eager to move past the notoriety of a missing person case tied to the property. Back then, no one pressed further. People wanted to feel safe, and believing the explanation of faulty pipes or settling walls was easier than considering the alternative. Now, with crews breaking open areas that had been sealed since those days, old suspicions began to surface. Families gathered in laundry rooms and courtyards, wondering aloud whether she had been closer all along. The thought unsettled them. If she had never left the building, if she had been hidden within its walls, then every tenant who lived there since had walked unknowingly above her. The idea spread quickly, mixing with the sound of tools echoing through the halls, making each new discovery feel charged with the possibility of something horrific. The resurfacing of these whispers inevitably reached her family. Her mother, now older but still relentless, received phone calls from people who had lived in the building long ago, sharing stories they had never told police. They described the odors, the feelings of dread, the suspicions they had carried silently for years. For her mother, it was both vindication and torment. She had always believed her daughter had not gone far, that someone knew more than they were saying. The possibility that her daughter had been inside the building all this time was a truth too painful to process. Even detectives who had long since moved on from the case heard about the rumors. Some dismissed them as coincidence, the kind of stories that naturally grow around unsolved mysteries. But others could not ignore the eerie alignment between the dog's losing her scent in the stairwell and the possibility of hidden spaces never fully searched. If her scent had ended inside, wasn't it possible that she had never left? That thought, once buried under years of unanswered questions, now pressed forward again with unsettling force. The plumbing crews continued their work, prying deeper into the bones of the building. Tenants watched uneasily, half expecting each panel removed to reveal something terrible. Conversations returned to that night 18 years earlier, with old neighbors replaying their memories in chilling detail. The case, once thought to be a story of a woman who disappeared into the outside world, began to feel like a story of something hidden much closer. And as rumors spread beyond the building, whispers grew louder. Had she been here the entire time, concealed within the very walls that had witnessed her last steps? The question, once buried beneath years of silence, was about to be answered. It happened on an ordinary weekday morning, nearly 18 years after she vanished. Maintenance workers had been sent to address a persistent plumbing problem that couldn't be reached through the usual access points. The job required them to cut into a rarely used crawl space beneath the main stairwell, a section of the building sealed off since before most of the current tenants had arrived. The workers expected to find rusted pipes, old insulation, and decades of dust. What they uncovered instead would shatter the quiet routine of the complex and reopen a mystery that had haunted the community for nearly 2 decades. As one of the panels was pried away, a wave of stale air rushed out, heavy and suffocating. Inside, the workers' flashlights caught on bundles of insulation, tangled wiring, and debris left behind from the building's original construction. But then, in the dim beam of light, something else appeared, shapes that did not belong. A closer look revealed the unmistakable outline of human bones, partially concealed beneath layers of insulation. Shock rippled through the crew. They stopped their work immediately, backing away from the dark, hollow space that had held its secret for so long. One of them called 911, his voice unsteady as he reported what no one had expected to find. Within minutes, police swarmed the building. Yellow tape cordoned off the stairwell, officers ushered tenants back into their units, and detectives who had long since given up on ever finding her arrived on scene. The crawl space, which had gone untouched for years, had become a sealed tomb. Forensic teams moved carefully, documenting every inch of the discovery. What they found was chilling. The remains were skeletal, but there was no question about who they belonged to. Tucked beside the bones were personal belongings, a ring, a watch, and scraps of fabric that appeared to match the clothing she had been wearing the night she disappeared. These items, once ordinary, now served as silent confirmation that the woman who vanished from the stairwell had been here all along. The news spread rapidly. Reporters crowded the property, cameras pointed at the building that had once been just another apartment complex but was now the center of national attention. Headlines declared the case solved, though in truth, it had only shifted from a mystery of disappearance to one of concealment. For her family, the call from detectives reopened wounds they had carried for nearly 2 decades. There was no relief, no closure, only devastation at learning she had been hidden so close to home, within walls her children once passed daily. Detectives who had worked the original case felt a mix of shock and regret. The crawl space had been overlooked in the frantic early searches, dismissed as inaccessible or unlikely to hold answers. Now it stood as a symbol of failure, a reminder that the truth had always been within reach, concealed behind plaster and insulation. Officers who had carried the case in silence admitted privately that they felt sick, knowing she had been there all this time, while the family begged them to look closer. Forensic teams worked methodically, collecting what remained of her life. The bones were fragile but intact. The ring and watch were bagged as evidence, each piece confirming her identity. The insulation, once meant to protect the building, had instead preserved the secret of her death. Experts noted that the crawl space had been sealed from within a maintenance area, suggesting intent, not accident. She had not simply stumbled into the void. Someone had placed her there, hidden her, and closed the space so tightly that nearly 20 years passed without discovery. Neighbors who had lived in the building during those first months after her disappearance came forward with renewed clarity. They remembered the unexplained odor in the basement, the unease they felt, the suspicion that something was wrong. They wondered how they could have walked above her for so many years without realizing. Some felt guilt, others fear, and many expressed anger at the idea that their concerns had been dismissed at the time. For them, the discovery was not just a revelation, it was validation of what they had felt, but could never prove. Her mother, now older and weary, stood before reporters once again, holding a photograph of her daughter. The grief in her voice was heavier than ever. For years she had pleaded with authorities to check every inch of the building, to search the places no one thought to look. Now she knew her instincts had been right, but the knowledge brought no peace. Instead, it deepened the heartbreak. Her daughter had been just steps away all along, hidden in darkness while her family searched the world beyond. The discovery triggered a reopening of the investigation, not to find her, but to uncover how she ended up there. Police revisited old suspects, re-examined statements, and considered the possibility that someone within the building's maintenance staff or tenant community had carried out the concealment. The case was no longer just about a missing person. It was about murder, cover-up, and the chilling fact that someone had kept the secret buried for 18 years. And as the remains were carried from the crawl space into the light, the community realized the haunting truth. She had never left the building. The stairwell where her trail had ended was not just the last place she was seen. It had been the gateway to her hidden grave all along. The remains recovered from the crawl space were transported to the county medical examiner's office, where a new chapter of the investigation began. After nearly 2 decades of waiting, the family was forced to confront the reality that the bones now laid out on a sterile table belonged to the woman they had searched for endlessly. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains were hers. The results, though long overdue, carried a finality that crushed the sliver of hope her family had clung to for 18 years. For them, the word confirmed meant the difference between imagining she was out there somewhere and knowing with certainty that her life had ended the same night she walked into the stairwell. Time of death, as best as it could be determined, aligned precisely with the night she disappeared. The bones revealed fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, though the extent of the damage was difficult to interpret after years of decomposition. The medical examiner noted breaks in the ribs and skull that could have come from an assault, but could also have been caused by compression in the confined crawl space. The evidence was suggestive, not definitive, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Was she struck and hidden there, or had she somehow fallen and become trapped in the dark? The medical examiner leaned heavily toward homicide, citing the improbability of someone entering such a space by accident, but the passage of time had eroded the possibility of certainty. What forensics could say with confidence was chilling. The crawl space had been sealed from the maintenance side of the building, not from within. This detail changed the course of the investigation. If she had fallen or crawled in on her own, there would have been no way to close herself inside so completely. Someone had done it deliberately, cutting her off from discovery and ensuring that she would remain hidden for years. That single fact reframed the case. It was no longer a matter of speculation about whether she had run away or been taken. It was proof that someone had concealed her. Detectives revisited their notes from 18 years earlier. The dogs had lost her scent at the first landing of the stairwell, exactly where the crawl space was located. At the time, no one had made the connection. Now, with the remains recovered, it became painfully clear that the canines had been right all along. Her trail had ended not because she had vanished into the night, but because she had been placed behind the walls just feet away. This realization brought both clarity and guilt, particularly for the investigators who had been there in those first desperate hours. They could not escape the thought that had the space been opened in 2005, the family might have had their answers immediately, and perhaps the person responsible would have been caught. The belongings found with her body added more layers to the story. The watch and ring were intact, undisturbed, suggesting robbery had not been the motive. The fabric scraps appeared to match the outfit she had last been seen wearing, further tying the remains to the night of her disappearance. Nothing about the evidence suggested a struggle that spread beyond the stairwell, meaning whatever happened likely occurred in that narrow space of time, between her leaving her apartment and the moment her scent disappeared. Whoever had taken her had acted quickly, with knowledge of the building and the confidence to access restricted areas without drawing attention. Forensic anthropologists examined the bones for any signs of restraint, sharp trauma, or other markers of violence. They found no stab wounds, no clear evidence of gunfire. But the fractures remained unexplained. Some experts argued the damage was consistent with being struck and incapacitated before being hidden. Others countered that in the years since her disappearance, weight and shifting materials in the crawl space could have caused the same breaks. The lack of clarity only deepened the mystery, fueling debate within the department and in the public. What stood beyond debate was the implication of the sealed crawl space. Someone with access to maintenance areas had taken the time to close it off after hiding her there. That detail pointed directly to human involvement and eliminated any remaining theories of accident or voluntary disappearance. Investigators now had to consider who, 18 years earlier, had both motive and access. Maintenance workers, tenants with knowledge of the building's structure, even property managers, all came back under scrutiny. Old interviews were pulled, names resurfaced, and questions that had gone unanswered for years were asked again. For her family, the forensic findings were devastating. The The confirmation of blunt force trauma suggested violence, but the lack of a clear cause of death left them in limbo. They wanted answers, not possibilities. They wanted accountability, not speculation. Each new detail revealed by the medical examiner seemed to confirm that she had been taken from them violently, but the absence of certainty denied them the closure they craved. They were left staring into a void of maybes, forced to reckon with the knowledge that someone had hidden her within arm's reach of home, and that person had walked away without consequence. As the case reopened with fresh forensic evidence, the weight of what had been missed nearly 2 decades earlier hung over every discussion. The stairwell, once a place of passing suspicion, was now undeniably the site of her final moments. The crawl space, once ignored, had become the center of the investigation, and detectives, both old and new, understood the painful truth. Someone had known all along, and the answer to who that was might still be out there, waiting to be uncovered. With the remains confirmed and the crawl space detail exposing deliberate concealment, detectives were forced to turn back to the beginning. Every name from the original investigation was pulled again, every interview reviewed with a harsher lens. What had once been speculation now carried new weight, because this was no longer just a disappearance. It was homicide. The estranged husband was the first focus of renewed scrutiny. In 2005, his strained relationship with her had made him a natural suspect. Custody disputes, arguments over money, and a history of conflict painted him as someone with motive. At the time, he had insisted he was with family when she disappeared, but nearly 2 decades later, the strength of that alibi had eroded. Relatives who once vouched for his whereabouts had either passed away, moved, or admitted their memories were fuzzy. Detectives pressed him again, asking how he could explain the fact that her body had been hidden in the very building where she lived. He denied involvement with the same defiance he had shown years earlier, but without corroboration, his words rang hollow. Still, denial alone was not evidence, and the lack of fresh forensic proof tied their hands. Attention shifted to the neighbor whose statement about a heavy thud had lingered in the file for years. Back then, it had been treated as a minor, possibly unrelated observation. Now, it was re-examined with urgency. Investigators wondered if that sound had been the moment she was struck, silenced, and carried into the crawl space. The neighbor, older now, struggled to remember exact details. He admitted that he had always wondered if he'd heard more than just a slammed door, but without clarity, his account remained circumstantial. Detectives noted the unease in his tone, the way his story shifted slightly under questioning, but once again, suspicion did not translate into proof. Then came the maintenance staff. Records showed that several workers had been employed in the building at the time of her disappearance. Most were tracked down without issue, but one name stood out. A maintenance worker who had routine access to locked utility areas had abruptly moved out of state within weeks of her vanishing. His departure had been noted but never investigated thoroughly. Detectives now saw him as a possible link, someone who not only had knowledge of the crawl spaces, but also the opportunity to use them. Locating him became a priority, and interviews revealed he had lived a transient lifestyle since, moving frequently and avoiding long-term ties. It raised unsettling questions. Had he left because of guilt, or was it coincidence born of unrelated circumstances? For the family, these developments were both a relief and a torment. On one hand, the case was finally being treated as the homicide they had always believed it was. On the other, the renewed scrutiny highlighted the failures of the past. They wrestled with the rage of knowing that if the crawl space had been searched in those first desperate days, answers might have come instantly. Witnesses might have remembered details more clearly, evidence might have been intact, and suspects might have faced justice. Instead, 18 years had allowed time to erode everything. Memories faded, alibis dissolved, forensic traces vanished. Closure, once again, slipped further out of reach. Prosecutors reviewed the findings but hesitated. The evidence, degraded by time, was circumstantial at best. The fractured bones pointed toward blunt force trauma, but without definitive cause of death, defense attorneys could dismantle the case. The belongings confirmed identity, but not who had placed them there. The sealed crawlspace proved intent, but not whose hands had done the sealing. The case was stronger than it had been years ago, yet still fragile, still vulnerable to collapse in court. For the family, hearing prosecutors speak in terms of not enough to convict felt like another betrayal layered on top of nearly 2 decades of silence. Detectives pressed forward despite the hesitation, following threads wherever they could. They interviewed former tenants who had long since moved away, asking them to revisit memories they had tried to bury. They chased down rumors of disputes, secret relationships, and grudges within the building. They cross-checked employment records, travel logs, and background checks of anyone with access to maintenance keys. Each lead promised revelation, but ended in exhaustion. The trail, once again, seemed to dissolve into fragments. The emotional toll on the family grew sharper. Her children, now adults, spoke publicly about their anger at lost years, about the pain of growing up without answers. They demanded accountability not just from suspects, but from the system that had failed them. They voiced the raw truth. Someone had taken their mother's life and hidden her within feet of where they slept, and for 18 years no one had uncovered it. Their grief, once private, became a public indictment of the investigation's early mistakes. For detectives, the pressure mounted. Every new interview ended with the same unspoken question. Had they reached the limit of what could be proven? They knew the case was solvable. Someone had sealed her in that crawl space. Someone alive still knew what had happened. But without direct evidence, the truth remained out of reach. And in that gap, rage, grief, and suspicion grew louder, fueling a desperate search for one final breakthrough. The discovery of her remains sent shockwaves far beyond the apartment complex. National outlets picked up the story, presenting it as a haunting revelation. A mother who had vanished from her own stairwell, found entombed in the very building where she lived. Reporters crowded outside, broadcasting live as police carried evidence bags and forensic teams moved in and out. For nearly 2 decades, the case had lingered as a whisper of tragedy in a single community. Now, it was a headline across the country, the kind of mystery that gripped strangers who had never known her name until now. Detectives framed the discovery as proof of foul play. The crawl space was sealed from the maintenance side, access limited to those with knowledge of the building's structure. The fractures in her bones suggested violence, not accident. For investigators, it was impossible to believe she had ended up there without someone putting her there. But despite this, no charges followed. Every suspect identified over the years denied involvement. Alibis had grown hazy, memories had rotted, and the evidence that remained was too fragile to withstand a courtroom trial. Prosecutors admitted privately what the family already feared. There would be no justice, only confirmation of what they had long suspected. For the children, now adults, the knowledge was devastating. The answers they had begged for since childhood had finally arrived, but they were answers without accountability. They had lived above their mother's hidden grave, playing, sleeping, and growing up while she remained just feet away. That reality became harder to bear than the years of uncertainty. Her mother, the grandmother who had carried the search alone, felt vindication that her instincts had been right, but the vindication came hollow, without the arrest or trial she had prayed for. The building itself became a symbol of horror. Residents whispered about the crawl space long after the case faded from headlines, describing it as a reminder of how silence can bury the truth. People moved out, unwilling to live where the walls had concealed a body for 18 years. For those who stayed, every creak in the stairwell, every shadow in the hallway, carried weight it hadn't before. And so, the case reached its conclusion, not with justice, but with revelation. The missing mother had been found, her final moments still hidden in uncertainty, her killer still unknown. The family gained the painful certainty of death, but not the comfort of resolution. What remained was a story both solved and unsolved, an answer wrapped in silence, a cold case that now had a body but still no name to attach to the crime.